Giving God glory and grace, we thank you for the opportunity to share today and thank our friend for the invitation. 46 years ago, dehumanized workers of this city's sanitation system continued to declare their humanity with the simple phrase, "I am a man." 552 months ago, a road-weary organizer who had his attentions on Washington, D.C. and poor people detoured to be with them for a little while. 2,392 weeks ago, the inner circle of staffers convinced that organizer and preacher to speak at a rally he originally sent one of them to lead. 16,790 days ago, the preacher reached into the resources of his studies in systematic theology and upbringing in the historic black church tradition to frame the local reality in the pulpit of the public square and in the headquarters of the Church of God in Christ. 402,960 hours ago, Martin Luther King Jr. stood and took on the mosaic mantle of the divinely inspired, God-called liberator and proclaimed, "I've been to the mountaintop. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land." 24,177,600 minutes ago, just one night after this proclamation of a coming liberation, this prophetic voice was cut down here in the city of Memphis. But 2,000 years before that, there was another who also identified with the oppressed masses and walked with people to affirm the imprint of God on their lives and on their personhood. There was one who came before. Jesus of Nazareth claims exclusive rights and authority for deliverance and true liberation when he declares, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them who are bruised." His is the true Emancipation Proclamation. His is the real freedom declaration. His is the authentic message of liberation. His is the original human dignity affirmation. Any act that moves in the direction of real freedom, authentic liberation, and human dignity is not about the people, persons, or government even acting. It is really about the capacity of God to move through human history to do God's will in this that is still God's world. And today, all over this city and dare I say across the nation, Dr. King is appropriately honored. In our hearts, he is cherished, and in our nation, he is revered, but he stands with us sub specie aeternitate, with the one who first declared that we might be free. And on a day like this, one might be tempted to ask if it is true that we are here worshiping a God who has declared liberation, centering on the Christ who stood to do so in the pulpit of his home church, if you will, if it is the case that even America's great prophet declared such in the city in proximity to where we currently sit and stand, how did we get here? If in the midst of civil unrest in which we had no standing or status, God took the side of oppressed masses of domestics and sanitation workers in the interest of freedom and ultimate deliverance, Jesus has made the preliminary and penultimate proclamation of freedom. A nation is moved to act favorably for marginalized people. After this, everything must be all right. Everything has got to be okay. It may be like the Isley brothers saying, nothing but smooth sailing. So how, 46 years later, did we get here? Median household income for black people, only 65% the income of whites. Here. unemployment rate twice as high in the black community than in the country. Here, where 40% of all African American children, 38% of all Hispanic children grow up in poverty and only 8% of whites do. Here, where less than 60% of our seniors in high school write at a level consistent with their matriculation. Here, where they score an average of 300 points lower on the SAT than their white counterparts. Here, where only 45% of black students who enter college finish it. Here, where less than half of all black homes have a computer in them. Can a brother get an email? Here, where half of all Americans without health care in 2013 were people of color. Here, where 1 out of every 5 African Americans still don't have health insurance. Here, where black men are twice as likely to die of prostate cancer. Here, where we're 10 times more likely to be victims of homicide or die from complications related to HIV and AIDS. Here, where 70% of our children are born to unmarried mothers, and this is even though 47 children are aborted in our community for every 100 that are actually even born. Rhetorical brilliance, organizing excellence from a true prophet, joined with the executive orders and political acumen of at least 2 powerful presidents and parties who have followed them, scores of people in the world's leading nation 46 years ago. All I ask then is, how did we get here? This is the same question people who worshiped with Jesus had to be asking for themselves. How did they get here? This is first public proclamation declaring the beginning of his ministry. Jesus claims authority, reading words written in the book of the prophet Isaiah. This means these words had been declared hundreds of years before among his people, yet they still needed liberation. This section of Isaiah talks about the vindication of the people of God after their Babylonian exile. Yet, when they look around the synagogue where Jesus stands to read, they see people oppressed by Roman authority. They see an impoverished people of God living under the rich rule of those people of greed. As a matter of fact, the words of the text perfectly describe the situation that Jesus' congregation, if you will, find themselves in. The only Jews who aren't poor are the ones who are helping the Romans take advantage of the other Jews. Their hearts are broken by the strain of working to be faithful to God, yet coming up short in the ways of the world. They are captive to a socioeconomic structure that maintains a vast chasm between the haves and the have-nots. Sound familiar? They are blind because they can't see the vision of God fulfilled in their lives, and they are bruised by a system of separation and subordination that tells them that they're not as good as the good people of Rome. These are the people with the words of emancipation already etched into their tradition, written on the scroll that was handed to Jesus, read, interpreted, and celebrated regularly in their life of worship. How did they get in? Why do they still need Jesus' freedom preaching? The prophetic writings of Scripture give 2 major explanations for how people end up in difficult and desperate situations, following a mighty move of God on their behalf. Opposition from external aggression, and unfaithfulness to internal allegiances. Maybe this is how the Jews got here, and maybe this is how we got here. Dr. King wrote about this issue of opposition from external aggression when he sat down in 1966 and 67 to pen his final book, beginning by describing the state of affairs in which he found the nation. After 10 tumultuous yet triumphant years of the civil rights movement, there was confusion over leadership, strategy, and who would get credit. More importantly, though, the people were divided, still living in poverty, burning down their own neighborhoods, grasping for direction, and separated from their former white allies in the struggle. King suggested that a major reason for the negative state of affairs was the white backlash that often follows black advancement. He spoke specifically of the resentment that followed the drama of the Selma event, which catapulted the nation into the passage of the Voting Rights Bill of 1965. He argued, not me, that Northern white allies were in full agreement with treating black people decently, but they were noticeably silent or vocally recalcitrant when it came to actually treating blacks equally. Some might say we see some of the same kinds of things today in our political environment, but I'll move on. Maybe we got here because of unfaithfulness to internal allegiances. Maybe our moments of emancipation and celebration were followed by episodes of apostasy. Maybe the glimmers of justice from God were followed by unfaithfulness to God. Maybe we secured political alliances in the nation but forgot the impact of a covenant with God. Maybe the same infighting that King experienced among clergy, particularly in the black community and community leadership, the same forgetfulness that civil rights was a faith-based movement empowered by the Spirit of God, the same arrogance and ambition that failed to give credit to God where it was due, the same racial division, the same self-destruction, and in some cases the same Uncle Tom-ism that got us there is how we got here. But the great challenge and opportunity for us in 2014 is not how did we get here, rather it is the answer to the Kingian question of that last book, and its title, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or community? He asked and I asked, where do we go from here? Formless void or ordered creation? Fallen humanity or likeness of God? Tower of Babel or Pentecost experience? Flood of destruction or ark construction? Flesh pots of Egypt or milk and honey of Canaan land? Assyrian hegemony or establishment of the kingdom? Babylonian exile or the new Jerusalem? Communal crucifixion or resurrection of righteousness? Where do we go from here? If we desire the fulfillment of a vision where the poor receive good news, the brokenhearted are healed, and the captives experience deliverance, the blind regain sight, and the bruised are liberated, we've got to follow the steps Jesus illustrates in the 4th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. First, if we're going to go a positive place from here, first we've got to go back to the place where we were brought up. It seems simple, but it's right there in the text. I figure we're all Christians, we just follow Jesus. Go back to the old neighborhoods that we got too good for. Go back to the old high school we got too educated for. Back to the spirituality we got too sophisticated for. Back to the family home we got too upwardly mobile for. Back to the mother wit we got too intellectual for. Back to the down-home values we got too prosperous for. Back to the deferred gratification we got too materialistic for. Back to the communal uplift we got too capitalistic for. Back to the quiet contemplation we got too technologically wired for. Back to the reconciliation we got too militaristic for. We've got to go back to the old landmark. Hey, you know, I'm from Texas. We still sing hymns down there. And I remember we used to sing, "Give me that old time religion. It's good enough for me." And we actually meant it. I wonder what would happen if you would let me muse for about 30 seconds. I wonder what would happen if we went back to living by Big Mama morals. It don't take a whole lot of scripture, a whole lot of systematic theology. Big Mama morals had just a few key things. First of all, Big Mama cooked in a pot big enough to give a whole meal away. Big Mama morals suggest you didn't just take care of yourself, you fought individualism by always making sure there was enough for them Johnson kids up the street. Big Mama morals suggested you keep some money tucked away. Usually she tucked it somewhere like that. Keep more money tucked away than you spent on the outfit you just tucked it in. Big Mama morals suggest that empathy is more important than education. And that if everyone has to have a reputational resume, let it be based upon how much one cares, not how many classes one has taken. I would suggest if we went back to the places where we were brought up, we'd be a little better off. And I got to tell you, this whole education and empathy thing, I'm a little biased. Can I share my bias with you? I'm biased because Laureen Turner, I called her Momma, was the most educated domestic in the state of Texas. Had a degree from Jarvis Christian College, but that didn't matter because in order to take care of her family, she decided to clean up other folks' homes. And so I grew up watching that, going to work on the bus with that. I saw Big Mama cook in a pot, not just big enough for her house, but big enough for somebody else's house. How long? How long would injustice, separation, isolation, and individualism last and stand if we could go back to the places where we were brought up? Now, I'm almost done. After we go back, we've got to stand. Can I go King James for a second? King James Version says, stand, he stood for to read and open the book. It's right there in the text. Jesus stands for to read. They hand him the book or the scroll. He opens it and finds his place in the book. As we stand to read with the sacred text in one hand of civil society and in the other hand, we discern the path toward bold, authentic Christian witness. It was, after all, a text of civil society that the young preacher who stood in Mason Temple 46 years ago was quoting when he said, somewhere I read of freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of freedom of the press. And somewhere I read that the greatest right of America is the right to protest for rights. But let us be clear in this Lenten season that it is the Holy Writ that is critical for witness of being church. In times like these, we must resist the correlation between advanced academic education and regressive reliance on spiritual practice. Sociologists who study the church in America continue to find that Protestant mainline denominations like ours with highly educated Christians also have low levels of the exercise of spiritual practice like daily devotion, Bible reading, and small group study. We've even gotten into monthly versus weekly worship attendance. I'm just quoting what the study said. If we will join Jesus in the liberation of Lenten discipline for this season and this society, we must stand to read and open the book. By now, you've got a taste for waffles, and it's Friday, so probably some fish. So I'll make this last move and I'm done. Finally, if we are committed to going the way of Jesus from here, we must decide and proclaim that this is the acceptable year of the Lord. To be honest, there is much theological debate about what Jesus is really getting at here in this circumstance when he proclaims the acceptable year of the Lord. Some scholars suggest that because this is the first foray into public ministry in his hometown, he is simply declaring the commencement of his work. They argue that the acceptable year is the time for Jesus to step out on history's stage and begin his work. Some say Jesus is talking about the full cycle or the completion of the redemptive plan of God, making the case that with his entry, God's plan was all said and done. The work was complete and the order had been fulfilled. The other significant theory is that Jesus is making reference to the year of Jubilee. This is the time in the 50th year following the 7 cycles of 7 years when debts are removed and people are given a fresh start. Well, since everybody's got a theory and theirs has some validity, I figure I add my extra Jesus to this exegesis. It seems to me when Jesus is standing, considering the mission of the prophetic servant described in Isaiah, standing in his home synagogue that he had gone back to, finding his place in the book, seeing the pain of his people and contemplating the vision of God for wholeness, restoration, reconciliation, and peace. What Jesus is saying in his emancipation proclamation when he preaches the acceptable year of the Lord is simply, it's about time. It's about time. Human time has intersected with God's time, and it's about time. The Chronos and Kairos have come together. The Chronos, measured by a clock or calendar, governs our daily lives. That met the Kairos, the special season in life when certain actions are appropriate or a time of exceptional opportunity before God. When Jesus proclaimed the acceptable year of the Lord, he was telling church folk, it's about time. The good news is here for the poor, and it's about time. Healing is here for the brokenhearted, and it's about time. Deliverance is here for the captives, and it's about time. Sight is here for the blind, and it's about time. Liberty is here for them that are bruised, and it's about time. The answers to our inquiries are tied up in time. It's about time. 151 years of continued captivity following the nation's emancipation proclamation. Time. 227 years of separation after the adoption of a constitution. Time. 237 years of oppression after the Declaration of Independence. Time. 46 years since the loss of America's greatest prophet, and the church that will get on board with Jesus has to understand, step out, and declare that it's about time. It's about Chronos, but it's also about Kairos, the season after the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, when prophecy of the suffering servant was declared. The season in Luke when Jesus opens the book and his prophetic ministry. The season when slaves of the Amistad cried, give us free. The season when Harriet smuggled Africans out of the South. The season when Rosa sat, Martin stood, and the community walked. The season when the city's refusal to recognize the Imago Dei in the faces of men twice kissed by God's Son, so they had to walk with signs declaring, I am a man. And while some thought it was about a situation or sanitation workers, others thought it was about Martin Luther King, it was really just the movement of God in human history giving us a clue that it's about time. It's time. It's time for people to proclaim God's peace. It's time for preachers to proclaim the gospel in public. It's time for the community to claim its connection. It's time for our leaders to listen to the least of these. It's time for the message to match the Messiah's. This is how we will join the true emancipation proclamation. Why are we here to preach the acceptable year of the Lord? How did we get here? By preaching the acceptable year of the Lord. Where do we go from here? Into the acceptable year of the Lord. Why? Because it's 2014, 46 years later, and the Lord knows it's about time.